Politics is rarely a place for quiet reflection. Usually it is a realm of noise, performance, and carefully managed optics. But when the calendar turns toward the end of the year, we have come to expect a very specific kind of ritual in this country. You know the one I am talking about. It is the televised year-end interview, a staple of the Canadian holiday season. Usually, these are cozy, predictable affairs. The lighting is warm, the interviewer is polite, and the Prime Minister is allowed to sit back and recite well-rehearsed talking points about compassion, the middle class, and the better days that always seem to be just around the corner. It is a comfort blanket for the national psyche, a way of convincing ourselves that the machinery of state is in steady, gentle hands. But what you saw this time was different. If you tuned in to watch Prime Minister Mark Carney sit down with the public broadcaster, you did not witness the usual fireside chat. What unfolded on that screen was something much sharper, more visceral, and infinitely more revealing about the precarious and frankly dangerous position that Canada occupies in the world today. It was not just an interview, it was a high-stakes interrogation. It was a stress test designed to reveal the difference between a politician who is merely reciting lines and a statesman who is grappling with the cold, hard mechanics of national survival. I want you to take a moment and consider that spectacle not just as a piece of television, but as a symptom of a massive shift in our national mood. The interviewer did not come to the table to praise the Prime Minister or to help him polish his image. She came to dismantle him. The tone was not deferential. It was pugnacious. The subject matter was not the usual trivialities of domestic political intrigue. It was about the existential threat looming just across our southern border. The questions were hammered home with a ferocity that suggested the patience of the Canadian electorate has completely evaporated. They wanted to know if Canada is ready for what is coming. They wanted to know if the man in the highest office is capable of staring down the volatility of a transformed United States. And most importantly, they wanted to know if we are, to put it bluntly, deluding ourselves about our safety in a world that has suddenly grown very cold and very sharp. When you strip away the noise and the dramatic music, the core story here is not about a bad interview or a hostile journalist. It is about a fundamental shift in the tectonic plates of North American politics. For nearly 80 years, Canada has lived in a golden era of geographic luck. We shared a continent with the world's largest economy, a nation that generally liked us, protected us, and bought almost everything we produced. We took the comfortable borderless commerce of the last 30 years for granted. We treated the 49th parallel like a backyard fence between friends. But that era has come to an abrupt and violent end. The Prime Minister was challenged on the one thing that keeps the entire Canadian political class awake at night: Donald Trump, the resurgence of aggressive American protectionism, and the terrifying possibility that our economic lifeline is being severed. The question posed to Carney was simple, though its implications are terrifyingly complex. Is Canada ready? In years past, a Canadian leader might have offered sentimental platitudes about our shared history, our common values, and our unbreakable bond. But that kind of diplomacy is long past its expiration date. Instead, Carney did something unexpected. He did not plead for friendship. He did not panic. He offered a lesson in the stoic acceptance of reality. I found myself struck by the specific quality of his response. In an era where performative outrage is the primary currency of politics, the Prime Minister chose a different weapon: clarity. When he was pressed on whether he was failing to protect the national interest against a belligerent Washington, he drew a line in the sand that was remarkable for its lack of hysteria. He essentially posed a counter-question to the United States, a question that every Canadian should understand because it will define your economic future for the next decade. He asked quite simply, what does America want? Does it desire a North American fortress, a unified bloc where steel, aluminum, lumber, and aerospace technology flow freely to create a global powerhouse capable of competing with the rising powers of the East? Or does it want chaos? Does it want to cannibalize its closest allies for the sake of a short-term populist sugar rush? This is the crux of the matter, and it is what I want us to walk through together. You see, the danger in these moments is that we, the viewing public, get distracted by the theater of the interview, the interruptions, the facial expressions, the gotcha moments, and we miss the profound shift in statecraft that is being articulated. Carney's response to the aggression of the interviewer was to pivot to a position of cool, almost detached confidence. He told the United States, and by extension the Canadian voter, that the choice belongs to Washington, but the preparation belongs to Ottawa. There was a refusal to accept the premise that Canada is a helpless victim of American whims. He suggested that if the United States treats its allies like threats while giving its true adversaries room to maneuver, then the defect lies in American judgment, not Canadian capability. This is a significant departure from the pleading tone we are used to hearing from our leaders. It suggests a new strategic doctrine, one that says, we will not wait for permission to survive. We are building, we are preparing, and we are securing our future, whether the Americans decide to cooperate or not. That kind of statement, delivered calmly in the face of a hostile line of questioning, is what we might call the Carney Doctrine. It is an assertion of agency in a situation where Canada usually feels it has none. But the question you must ask yourself, and the question we must explore as we dissect this interview, is whether this confidence is well-founded or whether it is merely a sophisticated bluff. The interviewer, sensing blood, did not let up. She pivoted to the other great power in the room, the dragon in the East, China. Here is where the conversation became truly fascinating for anyone interested in the messy reality of global economics. The broadcaster attempted to corner the Prime Minister with his own past rhetoric, reminding him that he once labeled China as Canada's most significant security threat. The trap was obvious. How can a leader who recognizes the security danger of Beijing simultaneously advocate for deeper economic ties with it? It is a contradiction that seems on the surface to be indefensible. How do you trade with a threat? How do you open your markets to a power you fundamentally distrust? Carney's answer to this was brutally realistic, and it reflects the hard choices that small nations living next to unpredictable giants must make. He did not try to reconcile the contradiction with moral platitudes. Instead, he invoked the first rule of investment and increasingly the first rule of sovereignty, diversification. He admitted with a candor that is rare in politics that Canada has had too many eggs in the American basket for too long. For generations, we allowed our proximity to the world's largest economy to lull us into a state of lazy dependency. We assumed the border would always be open. We assumed the Americans would always need us. We assumed that geography was a guarantee of prosperity. That era, Carney is saying, is over. This is why Carney was so insistent on the plural. He didn't just say we need another partner. He listed them. He rattled off India, the European Union, the United Kingdom, the nations of Africa, the Mercosur bloc in South America, and yes, China. It was a litany of alternatives. It was a declaration that Canada intends to weave itself so thoroughly into the global fabric that no single pair of scissors in Washington can cut us loose. You have to understand the shift in mindset this represents. For decades, our foreign policy has been essentially a corollary to our American policy. We spoke to the world through the filter of our continental partnership. Carney is proposing something different, a foreign policy of insurance. It is a recognition that in a multipolar world, alignment is a luxury, but market access is a necessity. And this brings us to the moment in the interview that every viewer and every political strategist was waiting for, the headline question. The interviewer, sensing the anxiety that permeates the Canadian electorate, asked bluntly whether Donald Trump is the single biggest threat facing this government and this nation as we head into 2026. It is the question that dominates every dinner party, every board meeting, and every editorial board in the country. We are a nation fixated on the volatility of the American president. We watch his rallies with a mixture of horror and fascination, parsing every syllable for a hint of our economic doom. The expectation, culturally, is for our leaders to share in this anxiety, to wring their hands and profess their vigilance. But Carney's answer defined a very different leadership philosophy, one that you will either find deeply reassuring or maddeningly detached, depending on your appetite for risk. He acknowledged, of course, that the situation in the United States is serious. He did not insult your intelligence by pretending that a protectionist administration in Washington is a trivial matter. He conceded that negotiations will be tense, that the stakes are massive, and that the sheer gravity of the American economy means we cannot simply look away. But, and this is the crucial distinction, he refused to let Donald Trump dominate Canada's destiny. Listen closely to the architecture of his argument. He said the real priority, the biggest challenge, is not the external threat itself, but our internal reaction to it. He spoke of the danger of letting the American drama crowd everything else out. This is a profound insight into the mechanics of governance. Carney is arguing that if a nation spends all its energy reacting to the erratic moves of a neighbor, it ceases to be a sovereign actor and becomes merely a satellite. It loses the capacity to build, to reform, and to grow because its entire bandwidth is consumed by damage control. He told the audience that Canada's job is to stay focused on what it can control. And what can Canada control? We can control the efficiency of our own economy. We can control the speed at which we build infrastructure. We can control the finalizing of trade agreements with those other nations he listed. We can control our own regulatory environment to make this country so robust, so stable, and so indispensable that whatever tariffs or tantrums emerge from the White House, they matter less. This wasn't fear. It wasn't the trembling of a junior partner. It was discipline. I want you to consider the phrase he used about building here at home. In the lexicon of modern politics, this often sounds like a throwaway line, a bit of filler to bridge the gap between sound bites. But in this context, it is the entire strategy. Carney is betting his premiership on the idea that the best defense against American unpredictability is Canadian solidity. If our industries are competitive, if our supply chains are diversified, and if our internal house is in order, we have leverage. If we are a mess of deficits, regional squabbles, and slow growth, we are victims. He is essentially telling you that the best way to handle Donald Trump is to stop staring at him and start working on ourselves. The interviewer, to her credit, did not let this pass without testing the armor. She pushed back, noting that while this high-minded focus on domestic building is all well and good, the American threat can very quickly become everything. It was a fair point. History is littered with nations that tried to mind their own business only to be swept up by the gale force winds of a larger power's ambition. But Carney remained unmoved. He insisted that while the U.S. negotiation is critical, it cannot be the sum total of our national existence. Then came the sharpest attack of the entire exchange, the moment where the abstract discussion of strategy collided with the messy reality of recent concessions. The critic put into words the frustration that has been percolating in the op-ed pages and the opposition benches for months. They listed the retreats. You stopped the retaliatory tariffs. You paused the digital tax. You apologized for the Ford advertisement. The implication was devastatingly clear. If you are so strong, why have you backed down? If you are building leverage, why does it look like you are suing for peace? They asked quite directly, what did Canadians actually get? Carney could have gone defensive here. The standard political playbook would dictate a pivot to keeping the peace or preserving harmony. Instead, he went assertive. He rejected the premise that these were losses. He argued that Canada is in a far stronger position today than it was 9 months ago, precisely because it stopped performing politics and started facing reality. He framed these decisions not as capitulations, but as tactical maneuvers to clear the decks for the real fight. By removing the irritants, the digital tax, the premature tariffs, he argues that Canada has purchased the goodwill and the breathing room necessary to secure the larger prize, the preservation of the trade agreement itself. He reminded everyone of a rule that too many emotional observers forget. You cannot control Donald Trump, but you can control the conditions under which you meet him. Carney insists that by de-escalating the minor skirmishes, he has preserved Canada's powder for the major battle. He pointed to the unmatched market access Canada still enjoys, noting that despite all the noise, despite all the threats, 85% of our trade is still flowing tariff-free. He compared our position to Mexico, to Europe, and to China, and asked you to look at the scoreboard. Who else has this level of access? Who else is sitting at the table with this much integrated infrastructure? It was a risky answer because it asked the voter to trust in the long game when the short-term optics look like weakness. But it reveals a leader who is operating on a timeline that extends beyond the next news cycle. He is telling you that strength isn't about barking back at every insult. It is about ensuring that when the dust settles, the factories are still open and the trucks are still moving. He is asking you to judge him not on the volume of his rhetoric, but on the survival of the economy. As we move into the mechanics of how this strategy actually works, you begin to see why he is so confident and perhaps why the Americans might be finding him a more difficult puzzle to solve than they anticipated. Let us look closer at the hard pavement of governance. When Carney speaks of building at home, he is not merely reciting a slogan. He is referencing a specific legislative architecture, most notably the One Canadian Economy Act. For the average viewer, this sounds like bureaucratic noise, but in the context of a trade war, it is a weapon. The United States has long complained, with some justification, that Canada is not a single economy, but a loose federation of provinces that often act like rival fiefs, blocking pipelines, impeding labor mobility, and erecting internal trade barriers that make us less efficient than we should be. Carney is wagering that by finally tearing down these internal walls, by making it easier to do business in Winnipeg than it is in Wyoming, he can increase Canada's productivity without needing a single permission slip from the White House. This is the control what you can control philosophy in action. It is an attempt to make the Canadian domestic market so frictionless that foreign capital, including American capital, has no choice but to engage with it. If the Americans want to put up walls, Carney intends to lower the floor, making the cost of doing business in Canada so attractive that market forces undermine the political desire for protectionism. And then there is the matter of the trade agreement itself. The interview peeled back the curtain on exactly how the government views this looming review. There has been a great deal of hyperventilation about the deal being ripped up or dead. The Prime Minister was categorical in correcting this. He confirmed that in his conversations with President Trump and President Sheinbaum of Mexico, the language used was not of destruction, but of review and adjustment. This distinction matters enormously. A review is a process, a cancellation is a crisis. Carney is banking on the fact that the American economy is now so deeply integrated with ours that their auto plants need our parts, their construction sites need our lumber, and their power grids need our electricity. He believes a total rupture is practically impossible without inflicting massive self-harm on the American voter. He is counting on the rationality of the American market to restrain the irrationality of American politics. It is a gamble, certainly, but it is a calculated one based on the belief that when the rubber hits the road, even the most populist president will hesitate to blow up the supply chains that keep his own economy humming. This brings us to the actors involved and the stark contrast in character that this interview illuminated. In Donald Trump, we have a figure of pure instinct, a leader who thrives on chaos, unpredictability, and the personalized exercise of power. He views trade not as a system of rules, but as a series of transactions to be won or lost on a daily basis. He uses uncertainty as leverage. Against this, Mark Carney presents himself as the anti-Trump. He is the technocrat par excellence, cool, precise, disciplined, and almost aggressively rational. Where Trump offers heat, Carney offers ice. In the interview, Carney refused to be drawn into the emotional vortex that Trump creates. When asked about the president's moods or threats, he pivoted instantly to timelines, processes, and structural realities. He spoke of the medium term. He spoke of timelines unfolding over the course of 2026. This was a deliberate stylistic choice. By refusing to match Trump's emotional intensity, he is attempting to de-escalate the psychological pressure on the country. He is telling Canadians that while the man in the White House may be volatile, the machinery of the relationship is durable. He is trying to make the trade talks feel less like a wrestling match and more like a contract negotiation. Tense, yes, but governed by interests rather than passions. However, we must also scrutinize the risks inherent in this approach, for they are significant. The interviewer questioned whether Carney's cool confidence might be blinding him to the sheer disruptiveness of the current American mood. There is a danger that a leader who relies so heavily on logic and economic data may misread a political movement that cares very little for either. The ethos of the current administration in Washington is not driven by GDP tables. It is driven by a sense of grievance and a desire for sovereignty. If Carney assumes that economic mutual interest will save the day, he may be bringing a calculator to a knife fight. Yet his defense of the sectoral tariffs issue, where he hinted that progress was being made on specific irritants like steel and aluminum, suggests he believes the deal can be sliced up and managed piece by piece rather than fought as a total war. He is trying to compartmentalize the conflict by solving the small problems quietly. He hopes to prevent them from coalescing into a single unmanageable crisis. This is the work of a plumber, not a prophet. It is unglamorous, it is technical, and it does not make for exciting television. But Carney's central thesis is that this boring, granular work is exactly what will save the furniture when the hurricane hits. The question that hung over the entire broadcast, and which remains unanswered, is whether the Canadian public has the patience for this strategy. We are a people who often demand moral victories from our leaders. We want them to stand up to bullies, to give as good as they get. Carney is offering something different. He is offering a strategy of absorption and deflection. He is essentially saying, let them shout, we will build. It is a mature approach, perhaps even a noble one, but it lacks the visceral satisfaction of a counterpunch. And in a political environment defined by anger, the absence of visible conflict can sometimes be mistaken for surrender. As the interview concluded, one was left with the impression of a leader who has tied his own fate entirely to the mast of this intellectual framework. If he is right, if Canada can diversify its way to safety and efficiency, its way to relevance, he will be remembered as the statesman who steered the ship through the storm without firing a shot. If he is wrong, if the American protectionist wave is a tsunami that washes away all economic logic, then his calm preparation will look like hubris. But for now, he has set the terms of the debate. He has told us that the threat is real, but the panic is optional. He has defined the year 2026 not as a year of doom, but as a year of review and adjustment. And he has challenged every Canadian to stop looking south with fear and start looking in the mirror with resolve. The mechanics of survival are set. Now we must see if the machine actually works. This brings us to the final reflection. What this interview revealed is a test of our own democratic resilience. We live in an age of polarization where the impulse is to retreat into tribal corners and scream. The opposition will say Carney is weak. His supporters will say he is a genius. But the reality he described, a world of shifting alliances, dangerous neighbors, and necessary compromises, refuses to fit into a simple partisan box. It requires a citizenry that is capable of holding two opposing thoughts at once, that we must work with the United States, and that we must simultaneously protect ourselves from it. It requires us to understand that there are no perfect solutions here, only trade-offs. We can have total sovereignty or we can have total market access, but we likely cannot have both in the same way we did in the 1990s. The holiday from history is over. We are now in the business of managing decline in one relationship while frantically building growth in others. It is messy, unglamorous work. It is not the stuff of soaring rhetoric or viral clips. It is the slow, boring work of hard boards. So as we stare down the barrel of 2026, I leave you with these questions to consider in the quiet of your own home. Is Canada ready to grow up? Are we prepared to accept that the United States is a foreign country with its own interests that often diverge from ours and not just a larger version of ourselves? And are we willing to do the hard internal work, the regulatory reform, the interprovincial cooperation, the economic modernization required to stand on our own 2 feet? Or will we continue to look south, waiting for a permission slip that may never come? These are the questions that will define the next decade of our national life. They are not easy questions, and Mark Carney, for all his confidence, cannot answer them for you. Only we can answer them by the seriousness with which we engage in our own democracy. I hope you will continue to think about this with me. If you found this analysis useful, if it helped you see the signal through the noise, I invite you to subscribe and join the conversation below. We have a lot of history to live through together, and it helps to face it with eyes wide open.